with this book and the exhibit, I wanted to show how quilts could inform what we know about the past, and by so doing, bring women back into the discussion of our shared history. And in my early drafts, I called it quilt speak, letting the quilts tell their stories. So we don't always know who made a quilt, but when I do know who made a quilt, I try and say something about them. And I also talk about what was happening in Maine when the quilt was made and things that might have affected their decisions in terms of fabric choice or its design, and how current events, just like current events affect a quilter's choices of things today, that also operates in the past. So what current events at the time are reflected in Maine's quilt? Next slide, please. So everyone always asks me, what's the oldest quilt? And so I'll talk about that. And first I'm going to look in the lower left, there's a number there. And that's called an accession number. And so the quilts that just have plain numbers are quilts from our collection. And there'll be something in the beginning like MHS, Maine Historical Society, and a number or something like that elsewhere. So you can kind of get a feel for how many of these quilts are in our collection. The answer is most of them. So this is our oldest quilt. The fabrics, there's two kinds of fabrics. So I was thinking I would be with the computer, so I'm going to kind of get in the middle and block things, I'm afraid. So this is a block print carved. That's every color has its own wooden block, which is carved away to only expose the colors that are going to get printed. And this is called copperplate engraving. And as you see, you get really nice lines, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a sheet of copper, a copper plate. An engraver uses a graver, a sharp little tool, to put grooves into the copper. So if just all you have to do, you see engraved things every day. Just look at a dollar bill. Or look at a $100 bill, whatever's in your pocket. Just look at it, and that's an engraving as well. So but instead of putting ink on it, you're putting dye on it. And some bright light in Ireland figured out how to do that in 1756. So this piece probably dates in the 1770s. So this is our earliest quilt. So I'm thinking it was probably made maybe around the 1780s. And I suspect that some of you are going, something's wrong with this picture, it's upside down. Well, guess what? It's not, because it's also about thinking about, you kind of realize how we look at the world a little differently than people did back in the day. So here's the quilt. There's a label right there. Here it is. This label is right side up when this is upside down. So I want you to think about the quilt. And we're used to having a quilt hung on a wall. So when we look at a quilt today, we're looking at it as if we are standing at the foot of the bed. But the quilts back in the day were oriented, nobody thought, oh, we'll hang this quilt on the wall. Fabric's expensive. Why would you do that? Put it on your bed, for heaven's sakes. It's cold out. So people put the quilts on the bed. The idea of quilts as decoration really didn't happen yet. So really the audience for a quilt were the people sitting or lying down in bed with it pulled up to their chins. So if you are sitting here and looking down at the quilt from this way, it's going to be right side up. So that's a fun thing about that. But that's our oldest quilt. And it's supposed to be from East Troy. But the thing is, there was no East Troy in 1780. And so I think that one of the early settlers probably brought it with them when they came. So we don't actually know where exactly this quilt was made, only that it spent most of its existence in East Troy. Next slide, please. So another thing to think about is how do quilts reflect history? As I was trying to say, this is one of the things I'm trying to pull out of these quilts and let them speak. And keep in mind that as of 1790, as late as 1790, over 90% of the Euro-American people living in Maine were British. They were either born in Great Britain or they were the children or grandchildren of people who were born in Great Britain. And if you add the Irish, we're at nearly 100%. We're like 98%. So it's a very British population in terms of the Euro-Americans. And quilts reflect that, absolutely. Yes, okay, so the medallion quilt, this is an 1804 medallion quilt. The quilt I just showed you was the earliest Maine quilt that I know about, but this is the earliest dated Maine quilt that I know about, and this is dated 1804. And this is called a medallion quilt. And there's this medallion, and then there's frames all around it. In this case, sort of 3.5 frames. These days, most of the quilts that I'm going to show you, you could never enter them in a quilt show today because they aren't perfect enough. So for those of you who make quilts, just relax. This is your heritage. Just relax. It looks great. So anyway, so this is a medallion quilt, and interestingly, they fall out of fashion here, but they continue to be made for a couple of more generations in England. This quilt, these two are the same quilt. As you see from the red, that's called a whole cloth quilt. It's actually several pieces of the same cloth, but it's called a whole cloth quilt. And what lovely as that tomato red color is, that isn't what makes the quilt special. In this, I have traced over all of the quilting in that quilt. So this is what the quilting looks like. And the decoration, it's a little blurry because this bottom is kind of wobbly, but if you can still make it out, I think. But there's like a little vase here and a heart. And then there are these vines coming up, and that's called a tree of life motif. And that motif was used, there's examples from the 1600s. I mean, this is a very old, already. This quilt was made in, here it is, 1838, and it was made for or by Rachel Chapman. And if you're able to see that, this is also upside down to us, but Rachel would have been able to read it from that side. So same thing as the other quilt. But there's a couple things here that are very British. One is these sort of wheel shapes. That's very, very British. The Tree of Life, lots of quilts that were made. And this was 1838, so this Baroque style was out of fashion, but we still see it in the bedroom in quilts. Everywhere else, they've already moved on. They've gone past Federal, they're an Empire style, but in the bedroom, some people were still using Baroque styles like this for quilts. And this is called gadrooning if it's in furniture. If it's on quilts, it's called feathers. But another thing that's very, very British and very subtle that you might not pick up on is these two lines are actually quilting lines. And a lot of British quilts have that little border of just two straight lines around the edge. And it's the British that do it. It's very British. So another thing that you notice, of course, is that these voids are here. And so that is where the foot posts of the bed would have gone. So we call this cut corners, but it's misnomer because the corners were not cut out. It was designed without corners. Okay, next slide, please. So what was happening at the time? What's going on when these quilts are being made? Well, if you think back to those halcyon days of the late 1700s, what's going on? Well, there's an American Revolution. That's what's going on. But there's another revolution going on too, and that's the Industrial Revolution. And within that, there's an amazing revolution in textile printing. And I've given you kind of a little hint of that with our old friend, the brown quilt, and that has block printing and copperplate engraving printing. And this is also block printed. This is a detailed shot of this quilt. This is from Scarborough, from the Libby family. These fabrics are from 1830. This fabric is probably 1750, and it might actually be from France, not England, which is interesting. But this is block printed. So remember that in this case, there's two blocks, one for the black, one for the pink, which is a madder red, made from madder. And then somebody later on, and it's hard to see in this picture, is they touched it up with a little bit of blue here and there on the flowers, and that was applied with a brush, like painted on. But of course, the British being the British, they don't call it painted on, they call it penciled. So, so that's block printing, and then we have our friends then we have that copperplate engraving. But both of those are very slow processes. With this one, for example, so you have two different colors. That's a relatively inexpensive block print. And so you print it, charge it with dye, print it, charge it with dye, print it, and then you just keep doing that for the whole thing. And then you move the fabric. Oh, wait, stop. I ran it. Then you do the next colors. And then you move the fabric and start all over again. So it's a very laborious process. It's still done. Yesterday, of course, I wore the perfect shirt. This is not block printed, but they're still doing it in India. And my shirt from yesterday was block printed. If you'd only seen me, you'd know. So those are very slow processes. This is a much bigger space. They're about 30-something inches. You know, they're a pretty big space, but they're still, you charge it, You print it, you pick it up, you charge it, you print it, you pick it up. Then you got to move the whole fabric again. And so it's very laborious. And some bright light said, what if we took that copper plate and we made it into a cylinder and we figured out how to roll it in the ink and then swipe it off to clean it, and then with pressure, it could get printed up on top, and then it could just keep going and keep going and keep going. And we could do more than one color at once, and they did. So by 1800, cylinder printing was the way of the future. And this is cylinder printed, and it's actually from 1830. And the other takeaway I want you to have from this quilt is that I don't want anybody saying, oh, those people, they had all these boring brown quilts. There were no decent colors in this. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know any of us would have put these colors together. So this is pink, this is mustard, and purple, and blue, and gold, all together in one quilt. So the 1830s, when it comes to colorways, the 1830s was a little bit like 1965 to 1979. I mean, it was just kabam, color everywhere. Next slide, please. And here, this is an amazing quilt that's at the Wilson Museum in Castine, and all three printing methods are in it. This is block printed, these little zigzags. Here's our old friend, copper plate engraving. And this is cylinder printed. So one of the other ways, when you're deciding to become like a textile scholar and you see a monochrome, the first thought is, oh, that must be copper plate engraving. Take a look at the repeat. So here's the repeat on copper plate engraving. That's one repeat. That's how big the plate is. And then here is the, I'm trying to find a way to point. I guess that's the most effective way. Sorry, middle finger. So here we have 1, 2, 3 flowers. So we actually have 1, 2, 3 flowers. So we actually have 2 full repeats in the same length of that. So the repeat is much shorter. And you tend to have 30-something inch repeats with copper plate engraving, and often only about a foot of a repeat with the cylinder prints. But boy, the results were amazing. Next slide, please. Yes. So I keep talking about Euro-Americans, but they weren't the only people living in Maine. The Wabanaki were here. They're still here. And one of the things that I'm really tickled to be able to include in this book and in this exhibit is Wabanaki textiles. I could go on forever. I wrote a book about this. I mean, so I'll promise I'll make this one short. But Wabanakis, if you think about the late 1700s, this was an incredibly difficult time to be a Wabanaki in Maine, because you've already had diseases wipe out, you've already had, hostile Europeans come in, you've fought some wars, and yet these objects are just spectacular. They're light, they're beautiful. They seem almost optimistic to me in retrospect. So here's 3 examples. It's called silk ribbon applique. So these are wool bases which are decorated with silk ribbons that are cut into shapes and stitched down. And that's Denny Saka Basin. These are not hers, but this is an example. So Denny Saka Basin in 1815, there's a red coat in the background. That's a hint. This is during the War of 1812 when the English had taken over the eastern half of Maine. And Denny, she went with her husband and her father. Her father was the chief of the Passamaquoddies. They went to the English fort, and an English officer painted her there. And let's keep in mind that this is folk art. So for years and years, we thought this was a doll. But the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Passamaquoddies, Donald Soktoma, said, no, that's actually her child. That's her baby. And it's on a cradle board. And these are cradle board wrappers. So if you think of cradle board wrappers as being kind of like swaddling clothes, you know how you sometimes you just wrap a baby up like a burrito to just kind of keep it calm and secure. Well, and then sometimes you put a baby in like one of those baby Bjorns and you carry them around. That's kind of what's going on here, but it's called a cradle board, and they carry them on their back. It's like a backpack for your baby. And so this is the fabric that would have wrapped them. But this is like a special occasion fabric. These were not worn very much. We all know that babies can be absolutely awful to textiles for any number of reasons, and these don't have that kind of damage. So I suspect that these were just they were for special occasions, for festivals and sacred days and that kind of thing. So they're early 1800s. This guy is named Francis Stanislaus, and he lived, that picture was taken in Bangor in 1890. And he's Penobscot, he's wearing a Penobscot collar, he's wearing some panels here, cuffs, and these panels are nearly identical to this. So much so that Donald, who I just mentioned, and the head of the Penobscot Museum, not the Penobscot Maritime Museum, but the Penobscot Nation Museum, the three of us had to look at, we're looking with really closely and under magnification to see if this was that. And it's not, but it's so similar that it had to be the same artist. So we now can say that these pieces were made by a member of Francis's family. We don't know who, but we at least know what family they belonged to, which is very exciting. The other thing is his photos from 1890, but he's wearing things that are at least 2 generations, maybe 50 years, maybe 60 years, maybe 70 years older than 1890. And the Penobscots were very pragmatic. These things take a boatload of time to make. So I don't know if you can see it very well, but you see that white line right there? That's a line of beads, okay? And then you see this little yellow line right next to it that's slightly smaller than the beads. That's a piece of silk applique. Someone has taken a piece of silk, sewn it down, cut it very close, turned it under, and sewn it again. So it takes an insane amount of time. It's the most detailed, delicate applique I have ever seen. And to think that this was done, at a time when there were no electric lights, there was no magnification, these women were astonishing. And it's also astonishing because this is the time, 1790 is when Euro-Americans start to really move in, because the federal government was giving Wabanaki lands to veterans of the Revolution. And so all kinds of Revolutionary War veterans and their families were just flocking up to Maine, to these new lands that they had. So the Wabanaki were getting shrunk into smaller and smaller spaces. So it was a very stressful time. But look at this amazingly delicate fabric that they were making. This piece, I'm saving this for last because it's kind of the best for last. So these pieces are 200 years old or more. This was probably made in the 1790s. And we never know. The stories are always lost. We never know who made a piece, except for this one. We actually know who made this. And not only do we know who made it, we have a photograph of her wearing it. So it's really spectacularly, wonderfully rare. And this is Molly Molasses's peaked cap. So we don't know what her real name was. I'm sure she had a name in Penobscot, but we don't know what it was. And she was baptized Marie Pelagie, and she was known to all of the people around as Molly Molasses. And so she made this when she was a young girl. And so she was born in the 1780s, I believe, 1785, I think, something like that. And so her parents would have been of a generation that survived the bounty hunting when Massachusetts was paying for scalps of the Penobscots. So this is, again, it's a really fraught time, and yet they're making items of such incredible beauty. So when you see these, not only are they just gorgeous, it's kind of a miracle that they happen at all, in my view. So next slide, please. So we're back to the revolution of textiles again. And so apart from the Wabanaki, who are doing their own thing in their own communities, and if you want to read into that, Uncommon Threads it's a book about it, and it talks about how you can read those textiles that they have made and find out identity information by reading them, because they embedded identity information within the graphic vocabulary of their clothing. It's kind of fun stuff. Anyway, so we're back to the textile revolution here. So this revolution in printing, being able to print fabric so much faster, means that you can produce fabrics much quicker and therefore much cheaper. And while I am sure that the manufacturers of printing did not pass on all of the cost savings to the public, fabric did become cheaper. And as a result, more different prints, cheaper fabric, women responded with a burst of creativity, and we get all kinds of quilts that this has dozens of different fabrics in it, as does this. And this one as well. And this is where there's a little, I'm going to do a little myth busting at the moment. So all these fabrics are new fabrics. So the idea that these quilts were made by these frugal women who recycled fabrics to make their quilts, occasionally that's correct. We have at least 2 quilts from the early 1800s that were made, early to mid 1800s, that were made with recycled clothing. But most of the quilts that we have are made from new fabric. And because people could afford to do it for the most part. This is actually patchwork wool. And so you remember seeing that tomato red whole cloth quilt, and that's the British way. This is what Americans turn it into. And there are, these piece quilts are really a northern New England thing. You get some from Vermont, you get some from Massachusetts / Maine, because of course we don't split up till 1820. But the epicenter of this seems to be in Maine. And you can say, well, that's because Mainers wore a lot of wool compared to, say, people in other parts of the country. And that's true. But another reason might be that one possibility is that Maine was really heavily affected by the War of 1812. And we could not acquire cotton. We weren't near any of the really biggest. By then, Philadelphia is becoming the biggest city. Boston's been surpassed. That kind of thing. So we're not able to get out. There's also privateers, and we may have the fastest, best ships in the world, but there's still people out there preying on ships and taking and burning the ships and capturing the ships and all that during the War of 1812. So Mainers really suffered because of this, and we couldn't get cotton from England. We're at war with them. We couldn't get cotton from France because the ships would get captured and all of their goods would be taken. So I think that one of the reasons that we get these wool quilts in the very early, say like the 1820s, and remember, this is 200 years ago. I can't really tell you if this was made in 1830 or if this was made in 1815. I just have to guess. There's not anything about this wool that can tell me exactly how old it is. But I'm guessing 1830s because of the colors. So I think that may be one. This may be a reaction to sort of global economics and politics that women start making patchwork wool quilts for a while until the 1840s, 30s and 40s when all these wonderful cottons become. And keep in mind too, in terms of going to go back on my high horse about color. So this quilt, this is where the window was. Can you see the difference in the colors here? So the window was on this side of the room, and this was in shadow. So keep in mind when you see that quilt that those colors were originally orange and black and turquoise and green, all in one quilt. So definitely different color sense than we have now. Okay, next. And that was also from the Libby family. Remember that wild one with the fabric from the 1750s, and that same family. And that was, I call the other one their Sunday go to meeting quilt because it was never used. The fabric is still glazed. But that one, that wool quilt saw a lot of use. So that brings us up to around the 1840s. And there was a big push, there was a big new fad in the 1840s. And it was coming out of the mid-Atlantic, especially Baltimore. And you may have heard of Baltimore album quilts. Well, album quilts became very, very popular, and they were popular for decades. But antebellum, which means, of course, before the Civil War, this was their heyday. And so in Baltimore, the quilt blocks are insanely complex. They are very delicate. They might have open work baskets that have flowers pouring out of them, cornucopia, lyres, eagles, all kinds of things. And they're very consistent. And the reason is that there were a couple of outfits, or a couple of shops where there were professional people who were, as their profession, they were making kits. They were cutting out all the shapes and selling the kits to women who would then sew them together and make these quilts. Well, let me tell you, an album quilt in Maine was amateur hour compared to that. Nothing is done professionally. Each person is making whatever quilt block they want to make. Occasionally you'll get one where it's all the same quilt block, but not very often. So you have things like this that are just, there they are. They're not really organized in any particular way. It's just, this is great. Let's put them all together. And this is made in a technique called potholder quilts today. We don't know what they called it, but we call them potholder quilts. And each one of these is separately made. So I'll talk about more of that later. This is the same. This is from Cape Elizabeth. So is this. This is 15 years later, 14, 15. This one, they've done a lot more planning. We have a medallion. And then this first row around the medallion, they've made a real effort to organize things. So there's roses at the corners, and then you have this is balance, orange, pink. And then after that, it's just, whatever happens. We just put it on there. Okay, let's look at the next slide, please. So everybody loves album quilts, I say, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I love them, so therefore everybody loves album quilts. And one of the reasons that we do is because there's often some just fantastic folk art that pops up on these. So if you're only having to do 1 or 2 blocks for a quilt, you can really put your heart into it. You can make something really spectacular. You may not have time to make a quilt that will go on your bed, but you can probably fit in the time to make something truly special for a friend, or for the minister who's leaving to go to a different parish, or to sell because you're trying to stamp out slavery or bring about temperance. So sometimes these quilt blocks are very, very fancy, and this is the case with this one. So this is a fishing boat with these gigantoid fish at the bottom, and there's a cartouche here with a name, and it says George Lovett. Well, George Lovett was a fisherman. So this is a depiction, I presume, of his fishing boat. With we call this fussy cutting today, where somebody's very carefully lining things up on the fabric to make sure everything matches. And I don't know about you, but all the fishermen, all the Maine fishermen that I know, who have been fishermen their whole lives, they have hands the size of catcher's mitts. They are not doing this level of incredible embroidery and applique. So chances are George did not make this. I'd put money on it. But there's another block that has his wife's name, so she may have been the person that makes it. And that brings us to the idea of inscribed names. So you can't always assume on an album quilt that the person who signs it is the person who made it. Just as that tomato red whole cloth quilt, I said it was made for or by Rachel Chapman. Her name is on there, but did she make it or did somebody make it for her? So it's the same type of thing. We don't know quite, but we do know. Let's say that this quilt, so many of them were made for, say, ministers or for someone who was leaving the community in some way. Sometimes a minister, sometimes someone was going somewhere else. And in that case, we can say that with certainty that whoever this was made for, George Lovett was an important part of their community. And that gives us a hint about what kind of communities there were in the area. And we can go ahead for the next slide. So we can kind of have fun with that. And sometimes there isn't a date, so we have to do some detective work. And now, because I've written a book, so I'm going to read from the book. And so this is trying to sleuth out when this quilt was made. So Angela Emery married Richard Lee Jr. on March 3rd, 1854. Her married name appears on the quilt. Valera Jane Smart married John Murch on August 28, 1859. Her maiden name appears on her quilt block. Together, these wedding dates imply that the quilt was made between the spring of 1854 and the fall of 1859. Quilts take time to make, however, and some blocks are finished earlier than others. Clues on another block might move the completion date later. That block is designed with an image of the Portland Breakwater Lighthouse. So does everyone know where Bug Light is in Portland? That's the Portland Breakwater Lighthouse. But originally, there was a wooden lighthouse there. And this is a picture of it. And there's initials WLW on the front, just in ink. So the half-mile-long breakwater was completed in 1837, and officials constructed a wooden lighthouse on the end of it in 1855. So that's within our range. Maybe this commemorates the building of the lighthouse, possibility. So let's move. The lighthouse didn't exist until 1855, so I'm going to adjust those dates for the quilt to 1855 to 1859. So William Lee Willard of Cape Elizabeth was the second keeper of the lighthouse. He served from June 1857, oops, I got to move the date again, to 1857 to 1859. So he served from June of 1857 until his death. in February 1860 of a tumor. He was 26 years old. So, all right, is this in honor of him getting the job, or is it in honor of, is it a memorial block for his death? Hard to say. So I'm now going to bump out the last date till 1860, just in case it's a memorial. So his older brother, Benjamin Willard Jr., took over care of the lighthouse until a new keeper could be found. In 1861, Benjamin and his wife Hannah Ann Stanley Emery Willard had a baby whom they named for Benjamin's deceased brother. So that actually adds another layer of when this quilt might have been made. And so I have down here 1861, but it's really circa 1861. It's really 1857 to 1861 when this quilt could have been made. I'll take the next slide, please. And sometimes quilt research saves the day. So this came to us, as you can tell by that number down there, the first number is 70. This came to us in 1970. And of course, in 1970, it was a lot harder to do genealogical work than it is today, right? For those of you who do genealogy. So this came to us with the story that it was made in South Bristol. There are names all over the quilt, and the person had found two people's graves, one in Round Pond and one in South Bristol, so only a few miles away from each other. But here's the thing. The women whom this person found had relatively common names. I can't remember the name of one of them, but the other was, I believe, Susan Clark. So the name Susan's fairly common, the name Clark is fairly common. But, so as I did with other quilts, I did a lot more work since we didn't really have this nailed down. We only had 2 names on the quilt, so I started looking for the names on Ancestry when I was getting the book ready. Oh my gosh, I could not find them. All I could find was the 2 people who had already been found. So I gave it up as a bad job. I sent in the manuscript, and then I sent the final thing to the manuscript on the day that the place closed for COVID. And at that point, I realized we aren't going to be able to, I was going to have, not be, rented lips. I was not going to be able to have the book for another year, so I actually had some extra time that I could try and track down this quilt. And by golly, Ancestry had an update in that interim. So I tried to I don't know if you can see this, and you know what, don't worry if you can, because you cannot see it. From me, I mean, it kind of looks like Tryphaenusa? Honolulu. I don't know. And the closest we could come to that was Triphonia Handlet. So, all right, there's a name for you. So that is not a common name. So I typed that in. I've come up empty before. And this time I type it in and it says, oh, do you mean Tryphosa hoodlet? And I'm like, yes, I do mean Tryphosa hoodlet. So I looked up, and she is from the town I live in Dresden, Maine. And that was so much fun. And then I started entering all the other names, and bing, 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 bing. They're all from Dresden, except for one who's from Pittston. But it was so exciting to actually be able to figure out where this quilt was actually from. And then I'm still trying to figure out the minister's name that it was made for and all that. But I have a much better chance now of finding that out, that I know it's not from South Bristol and that it's from Dresden. So there's one more thing I want to point out, and that is people ask me, this is kind of separate from this sort of historical discussion, but people ask me all the time, what makes a Maine quilt a Maine quilt? And there isn't usually one thing that you can say makes a Maine quilt a Maine quilt, but this quilt really checks all the boxes. It has these 4-poster cut corners. That is, have any of you ever seen the book Little House, Back House? Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn by somebody whose name I've just gone out of my head. Anyway, wonderful book about connected farm buildings. And they're all over New England, but the epicenter is here in Maine. And it's the same thing with these. You do get cut corners other places in New England, but here in Maine, for some reason, are we more stubborn? Are we more traditional? Are we more conservative? Are we just simply poorer and can't afford a new bedstead? For whatever, all of those reasons, exactly. Mainers continue to use 4-poster beds for a lot longer, and we actually have 4-poster bed style quilts up until around 1900. So it continues here, and it's a much more popular form here. This is the potholder quilt method, which I told you about. It's the same type of a thing that it is found occasionally elsewhere, but most of them are found in Maine. What else? The fact that it's just kind of a smorgasbord of design. There's not one theme. The theme here is anything goes. And there's all kinds of, and they're not really organized in any kind of way. That's kind of a very main thing. But any of those individual traits can be said of other places in northern New England. But there's another thing as well, which I don't know if it's found that much elsewhere. And that is, Mainers like to frame their blocks. So here's a block of right? And then there's a border. There's a frame. Here's a block called square and a square. It has two frames. Here's another block, this star with a frame. And then not only that, they added something, an extra block in the middle as well. Here is 9 patch, which they've kind of tarted up by making it with a bow tie, and 2 frames. Pinwheel with a frame. Here, this one has 3 frames, and it goes on and on. Half of those have extra frames within their block. So you put all these together, and if you had to ask, like, if I just saw this quilt and didn't know anything about it, I've said Maine, because it has all those different aspects of Maine quilts. Okay, now I really am ready to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this brings us up to the Civil War. And individuals expressed their care for the importance of the Union to them by making quilts. This was made in Jay in 1864. This woman, her children, Octavia Lewis, her children were too young to serve. She had 4 sons, but they were all, the oldest I think was 15, and he did not serve. So, but she obviously supported the Union. But also groups, all those album quilts that we just saw, those were all women's groups that were making these things. And they might be the church ladies had a sewing group or had an activity group. And it might have been a group that was against slavery or was for temperance, and they would make them to sell. So sometimes, but anyway, it's a community group that's making them, usually a community group of women. And the Civil War was, they'd been training for the Civil War, for a response to the Civil War. They've been training for it for 20 years. These women were poised to act when the Civil War came along, and they sprang into action, and they made, these groups switched gears and began making things to benefit the soldiers and the Union cause. So they were making socks, they were making quilts that would be sent to the hospitals, and they were also making quilts that were probably for sale so they could send cash to relief societies for the soldiers. And this is another potholder quilt. Can we go back again to the last one, please? You're being very patient with me, thank you. So this actually shows some downsides to the potholder method, because there's always one in the group that says, oh, you said 12 inches? I thought you meant that it was supposed to be 11.5 inches, because, so there's always somebody. So you notice that this is not the same size as this one. These corners don't line up because they aren't square. This one is bigger than this one. There's a fold here because this block is not even square. I might have made that block. I'm not very good at this. So this is sort of the pitfalls of making a potholder quilt. So when you make a quilt, like an album quilt, let's say I'm going to organize an album quilt, and you're all going to send me your blocks. And then I'm going to sew them together, and then I'm going to make a sandwich. I'm going to baste it. I'm going to quilt it. I'm going to take the basting out. I'm going to give it a binding. That's a lot of work. But if I say, send me a finished square, and we do it potholder method, you are doing the quilting and the binding. All I have to do is whip stitch them together. It makes it a much more streamlined way of making a group quilt, but you can get things that kind of wave in the breeze as they're on the bed. Next, please. And this, on the other hand, is like the way a potholder quilt should be. This is so perfect. But I think the reason it's perfect is that the organizers sent the women the stars already sewn on their block, so the sizes would be guaranteed to be the same, and they'd all be centered on the block. I'm pretty sure that's how it worked. And this was 2 young women from Portland who were neighbors that their name appears most often on the block, so I'm assuming that they're the organizers. And we were trying to figure out how are they connected. They're not, it's got to be more than just neighbors. We thought maybe temperance, because Cornelia Dow was one of them. Her father was Neil Dow, father of Maine Temperance. But what we found is they were both alumni of a girls' school in Portland called the Portland Home Institute. And all the women, all the girls who are on the quilt are either students, alumni, or staff of the Portland Home Institute. And all these things that look like, this looks kind of dirty. That's not dirt. That's all ink. So each of these blocks was inscribed before it was quilted. And the inscriptions, a lot of the inscriptions are poetry. Guess who? Of course, Longfellow gets a lot of play on this quilt because he was in the neighborhood. They lived in the same neighborhood as his family. But there's also one of the things I was very impressed by. We've been using Google Books to try and track down these documents, what they quoted. And so this was made in June of 1864. And one of the quotations that we found was first published in a literary journal, a national literary journal, in May 1864. So these women in Portland are reading the very latest literary things that are published, and they're quoting them on this. So it really speaks to the quality of education that they got. Next, please. So what happens after the war? Well, lots of things happen, including Maine really gets transformed again. So after the war, a lot of new cotton mills start getting built further up the river, and there aren't enough farm girls anymore to fill all of the job needs for all of these mills. So we start getting a lot of immigrants, like French Canadians start pouring in and looking for a better life for their families. So that's really changing Maine. And actually, even before the Civil War, as early as 1850, the two Maines that we talk about today, that was already evident. And by 1860, it was finalized by 1860. So Maine has really changed. But again, because as advances in technology keep making it faster and more efficient to produce cotton, the price keeps going down, the colors keep being vibrant and exciting, and with more inexpensive cottons, women just keep responding to that. So probably you guys are going to be in the same boat. Your historical society is going to be in the same boat as our historical society, every historical society in Maine. Most of the quilts that we will wind up with in our collections, unless we are very careful about what we collect, will be from 1875 to 1900, because there's this huge boom in quilting because people can afford to. The quilt, the fabric is much less expensive, relatively speaking, to their income than it used to be. And because there's so many prints, the other thing, of course, that's happening, which is very important, is that women are getting sewing machines. Now, the sewing machine was invented before the Civil War, and people started using it during the Civil War. But it wasn't until after that Singer figured out, hey, if people buy this over time, they can get it, they put a down payment, they pay monthly, they'll get that into their home. And the payment plan comes into effect, and you know what, we've been using it ever since. I mean, how many of you guys have a car on a payment plan? Most of us. So it's the same type of a thing, something that's really expensive, you buy it on time. But that saved women so much time. Even if they didn't use it for quilting, this is called a postage stamp quilt, and the blocks are 1 inch square, and each is a half of it. There's 2 triangles that make up that square. Nobody's going to use a sewing machine to make that in the 1870s. They're going to do hand sewing. But even if you don't, you're able to have the time to do it, because now you can make your husband's pants, your daughter's dresses, your dresses with a sewing machine. So that's very important. And with these new fabrics come these crazy little postage stamp quilts, because you've got all these new fabrics and you're trying to figure out what new to do with them. And this, it's a little blurry because of with the machine. But so every diamond on this quilt, every single diamond is from a different bolt of cloth. There are no 2 pieces of fabric from the same bolt of cloth, none, all different. And those are called charm quilts. It was a thing, charm quilts. This is not a charm quilt. I don't know if you can see, but there's a lot of greens up here that they have in common. But that's definitely a charm quilt, which you could do now because you had show off the fact that you have access to so many different fabrics. These are also postage stamp quilts. These are the ones I was telling you that these are from about 1895, and they still have the 4-poster going on. And just another spectacular quilt from this time period that I just had to include, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's hand sewn, but it is spectacular. Okay, next, but see how fussy these all are. There's a lot of work that goes into these, a lot of planning. The one on the side of that starburst, that is just insane, and she did it so well. It's completely flat, and she probably could do that because she didn't have to sew clothes with the sewing machine. Next, please. And these are also from the same time period. These are all called log cabin quilts. They're all variation on log cabin quilts, different styles. They all also have their own names. But again, look how incredibly exacting all these pieces are. There's a lot of planning and measurement and math that goes into something like this. And so with every action, next slide please. With every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I swear that's probably why crazy quilts came to be so popular, is that a certain generation of women or a certain woman just said, I am tired of measuring. I am just going to do this free-for-all quilt. This looks so freeing and liberating. And it was. So this is called a crazy quilt. We've all seen crazy quilts, am I right? These are, it's interesting. Cotton quilts, I don't care how fancy it is. The quilts I know about the most are not the quilts like I just showed you before. It's the crazy quilts. Everybody recognizes how much work went into a crazy quilt. And so those are the ones that we have names for every single person that made one. And their big heyday was in the 1890s. This is all silk. Every single square inch is embellished, either painted or embroidered. This is a woven ribbon, but they're just busy, 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 busy. And you can see here, this one's a wool quilt from a little later. It's 1884, and this one's turn of the century, and it's wool. So Mainers had a lot of wool, and they made a lot of crazy quilts with it later on. And again, these are not bed quilts. These are quilts, these are expressions of creativity that were meant to be displayed. And they were kind of to show off a woman's needleworking skills and her access to silk, oh, by the way, which you could order boxes of silk scraps through the mail. So that was a little disingenuous. This one actually dates to 1912, and it's on black velvet, and I absolutely adore it. And those bright colors, those bright flowers and leaves, those were flowers from making hats. This is scraps from a millinery. And it's from, actually, the woman who made it lived in Caribou. And the nearest millinery that I can find, there are 2 millineries in Presque Isle, but I can't yet find any link to how she knew them. But they continue to be made. They're still made today. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the 20th century. And I'll tell you first about this little one. This boingy one here. That's made from poultry ribbons. It's all chicken ribbons. So the person that made it, her grandmother and her mother-in-law were all really active in Maine, the Maine Poultry Association. So these are all prize ribbons from chickens. So that's kind of fun. So it's actually not cotton, it's rayon. Now take a look at these two are from the 30s, 1930s. And take a look at those colors. Can you go back 2, please? You're being very patient, thank you. There we go. Look at the difference in the colors. Completely different colors, really strong reds, strong browns. Okay, let's go back forward 2 more again, please. Thank you. So here we have these pastels. So what's going on? Yes, there's some time frame, but this is a really big leap. So let's think back to those halcyon days of the 19-teens. What was going on in the 19-teens? How about World War I? So the center in the late 1800s and very early 1900s, the center for dye production in the world was in Germany. World War I hits, the factories get changed over to the war effort, and then of course they get demolished. So after the war, Germany's economy is in ruins, and American chemists come to the forefront as the manufacturers of dyes. And when they make textile dyes, they actually make them with something new and exciting in mind. They make them so the fabrics look good under those newfangled electric lights. So women in Maine in the 1930s are using fabrics that are designed to look good under electric lights that they probably don't even have yet, for the most part. But that's just a fun tidbit that here, the choices they're making are based on, are influenced by a world war and electricity. It's not what you really think of. Oh, that will inspire my quilt, but it really does. Another thing that's changed is how people are finding out about patterns. So this is called Memory Bouquet and or Memory Garden. I can't remember which. Might be Memory Garden. No, I think it's Memory Bouquet. Doesn't matter. But it was designed by a woman named Eveline Foulard, who did designs of quilt blocks for the Kansas City Star. And that newspaper then sold them across the country to other newspapers, and you'd get one a week, and you would look for it in the newspaper, and then you would make the quilts. So there are other quilts all across the country that have these exact blocks, the same size, the same layout, different fabrics, of course, different combinations. This one's actually a little different because only 11 of them are from the Kansas City Star patterns. The 12th pattern in the series was holly, and this, she didn't want to use the holly, she just had summery flowers. So all the other quilt designs are something that somebody else designed, and I don't know, I haven't been able to find it yet. Doesn't mean it's not out there, but it may have actually been designed by the makers. And they, the people who made this, the woman that made this, that's credited with making this, she lived in Dover, but I discovered doing my research that her mother, who made those little ones that had, I said from 1895, that had the cut corners, that was her mom. And so her mother was also a very talented seamstress, and they probably worked on it together. But it sort of tells you again how the country is shrinking in terms of being able to get designs from Missouri, and then a couple weeks later those designs are in Maine. This piece is actually from 1996, and in the late 1900s, instead of having a social group that made quilts, you have quilt groups that make quilts for social reasons. So it's a slightly different thing. This isn't like the Women's Sewing Circle of the Church of East Overshoe Falls. This is a quilt group, and then they make, a lot of them will make what they call charity quilts to benefit other people. But this was made by the Clamshell Quilters of Damariscotta, and it's the 12 Days of Christmas, and that's 4 chickadees. And we're almost done because that brings us to now. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a quilt group. This is actually not a quilt group. This is a social group. This was made by the Phippsburg Welfare Committee or Association or Society. But it was made in 1935 and sold in 1936 to raise money. So the ladies of the Phippsburg Welfare Society, they would raise money for the library or for the fire department. But in 1934, they realized that kids were going to school without shoes, height of the Depression. And they decided they would raise money for individuals instead of for organizations. And so they made this quilt and raffled it off. And this is called the song quilt, because every one of those blocks represents a song. And to win it, you had to put money and then guess the songs and try and match them up with which square was which song. And some of them, you'll even be able to get some of these. Okay, bear with me. It's hard to see it, but this is a bear going over a mountain. I bet you know what song that is. I bet you didn't know, because I didn't. You can't see it very well, but this is Tiptoe Through the Tulips. I had no idea it was from the 19-teens. It's from the 19-teens. Here's a sidewalk with people on it and a big cityscape, sidewalks of New York. Here's an owl and a pussycat in a pea green, going to sea in a pea green boat. So some of them I can get. Some of the others I have no idea. I got all but 2 of them after a lot of hard work. So, and then on the right, there's a quilt that was made for the bicentennial. As some of you remember making quilts for the bicentennial. Did anyone do that here? Nobody raised their hands. Oh my goodness. So a lot of towns did. And this was made by a group of older ladies in Augusta. and they were living in some kind of a nursing home, but a retirement home. It wasn't really a nursing home so much. And as with a lot of bicentennial quilts, it's all the highlights, the important places in town. So we have, here's the State House, here's the church, here's the fire department, here's Fort Western, and here's the library. Here's my favorite, important Augusta landmark, Mr. Market. I just love it. I just love this quilt. And there's a big gap here to help me remind you that. So between these two quilts, there was actually a lot of time where people just weren't making many quilts. There's hardly any from the end of World War II until 1976. And my hunch is that it has a lot to do with the Depression. Because in the Depression, not only was there not enough to eat for a lot of people, you couldn't buy clothes. You didn't have the money to buy new clothes. You certainly didn't have the money to buy fabric to make new clothes if you didn't already have it for the most people. And I think for a lot of people, the idea of making a quilt had to do with reused fabric. This is from Curtain Fabrics. You know, they're reusing fabrics when they're making this quilt. So I think for a lot of people, it was just like, let's put that behind us. And then when the bicentennial came around, quilting began to be done again and in a big way. And now I'm ready for the 21st century. Sorry about that. Next slide, please. And so quilts today. So today, it's really, these are all art, what I would call art quilts. So if you think about an art quilt, that is a quilt that's not designed to go on the bed. It's a quilt that it exists for the expression of the artist. The artist is expressing themselves in this quilt, just as they would in a painting. So if you think about crazy quilts, those were some early art quilts, right? They're just artistic expression. And this is the same way. And so I don't have any pictures of traditional quilts here. If someone's making a traditional quilt, they want a quilt for their bed. They want something warm. They're probably not going to hang it on the wall. They're probably going to put it on the bed. And it's going to keep them warm in two ways. One is physically, it's warm and comfortable, but also it's a pattern that they have probably seen their whole lives that maybe reminds them of people they loved. And it is a comfort emotionally as well as physically. And of course, it's beautiful. They're lovely quilts. So that's really what most traditional quilts are. And in the art quilt, there's kind of two categories of art quilt. And one is people like Wendy Reed, who is amazing. She's from Bath. And she loves antique quilts. She loves traditional quilts. And she uses these motifs. These are traditional motifs. This one happens to be from Pennsylvania, but it's an antique motif. And then she combines them in a way that you would never say that was from the 1800s. This is a modern quilt. And oh, by the way, that's another potholder quilt. She's the queen of potholder quilts. So she's kind of a neo-traditionalist. And these folks who all identify themselves as art quilters, two of them have a little bit of tradition hidden in them. So Sarah Ann Smith, this is not what you would call a traditional quilt, but each one of these little rocks of this labyrinth is hand appliqued. The leaves are hand sewn, and then there's embroidery around the side. So even though it's an art quilt, there's traditional aspects to it. This quilt is actually a whole cloth quilt. So Gail Frass and Duncan Slade, our partnership, they've been making art quilts since before the term art quilt was invented. And they were actually invited to be part of the first exhibit about art quilts. So they've been in business together a long time, and they do some amazing work. And we purchased this one in 2021. And so this is a whole cloth quilt. They've painted this design using fabric dyes. And then this honors, it's also a very personal quilt. A friend of theirs and one of their parents died on the same day, a couple years apart. And on the anniversary of these two deaths, they went down to the river behind their house and took in the sky and thought about these people. And they commemorated them with this quilt. So this is the sky that night, and they've embroidered the constellations. And then one thing that you can't see because it's on a surface like this is there's round quilting all the way through it. If you've ever laid awake at night camping or something, you know how the Milky Way kind of spirals across the sky. And that's the same effect that you get from this. So these are all art quilts, but they're also traditional in some way. And then Jude Spax, she does some just fantastic, what's the word I'm looking for? I have had it. Anyway, she just applies all kinds of pieces of fabric together, and she might use 20, 24 pieces of collage. She uses 20 or 24 pieces of small pieces of fabric just for one eye that's this big. And what you get is you get a profound depth when you're near it. And that doesn't look like, that looks like it's printed almost, but it's really, when you see it in the flesh, it's really three-dimensional. Okay, and you see this technique, you see these threads, this traditional thread, the neo-traditional thread, the art quilt thread. If you look back at these quilts, you really do see that. And because we're used to seeing them, we've been seeing them for, these are 100 years old, we're used to this. But at the time that they were made, some of these were really cutting edge. Okay, next slide, please. And here's another community quilt. This is the most recent quilt that's in the book and it will be in the exhibit. And this was completed in 2019. So the woman who made this quilt, I photographed it before it was completed. Just this is the quilt top. She became ill. And as part of her rehabilitation, she wanted to be able to quilt again. And so she started by just applying a circle a day. She just, it's a circle about this big on a piece of fabric, about that big. And she kept it to a light color in the background. And then this is the back of the quilt. She cut out, to make it lighter, she cut that space out where they overlapped. And in that 1/4 inch seam allowance, she wrote down what she did that day. So every block is like a diary. So this is the back of this, so you can kind of see that these were the same. Well, this one talks about the fact that her friend Mary came to visit, and the fabric echoes what happened that day. So she'd sit down in the evening and say, what happened today that I want to sew about? And so here her friend Mary came to visit, and she said, oh, I have some Christmas fabric with the Virgin Mary on it. So she put the Virgin Mary on, and then on the back, my friend Mary came to visit. This one, this is stars in the blue sky, and she was reading a book that was about stars in the sky. This is World AIDS Day. She talks about that. So they're all here, and in the end, you have a year in the life of a Mainer and a Maine community. And I really think that 50 years from now, this is going to be one of the most important quilts in the country. And I think that's all. It's getting late. Do I have time for one more quilt? Okay, I'm hearing sure. Let's go on, please. One more. One more. Okay, so this is, okay, I'm just going to stand here for a second. So this is something silly. As you may have guessed, I can be very silly. And Diane can attest to the fact that I can be very silly. So when the book came out, of course, COVID is in full fling still. So I didn't get to do the whole book tour and all that kind of stuff. So a friend of mine who owns a bookstore asked me, did kind of an interview with me instead. And he said, what was the funniest thing you did as you were researching this? And I'm like, there wasn't really anything funny. There were lots of things that were fun, but nothing funny. I said, can I make something up? He said, sure. I said, okay, I will. And so this is my story. Now, as we look at this quilt is from 1868 in Alexander, Maine. Does anyone know where Alexander, Maine is? I'm shocked. It's in the middle of nowhere. She bought, her name is Andraine Cotter, and she bought her fabric actually not in the US. She had to go to St. Stephen's in New Brunswick to buy her fabric because that was the closest town of any size. So it's down east, Washington County. Today it's still just as small as it was in 1868. So when you look at this quilt, it's pretty boingy. It has these wonderful sort of psychedelic stars and moons and suns. But keep in mind that what you're seeing is not nearly as bright as it once was. All those tan leaves, those used to be bright green, and the blue has faded. So think of this: bright green, bright red, bright pink, blue, yellow, gold. This thing was wild. So I'm going to talk about the myth of Peter Max and Andraine Cotter of Alexander, Maine. Next slide, please. So, Peter Max was a psychedelic, he's still alive, psychedelic artist, especially known. He designed the Yellow Submarine. I mean, he did that, it was that era, it was the 60s, it was wild. But so my story is that Peter Max was, I can't remember if he was in London or New York at the time, but he was just feeling very, very frazzled because let's face it, 1968 was a difficult, crazy, crazy year. So he decides he's going to do some time travel and try and just get a little peace and quiet. And so he goes back in time 100 years to 1868. And somehow he winds up in Alexander, Maine, which was a mistake, but oh well, there he is. And he meets up with Anne Drain Cotter, who's making this incredible quilt with these wild suns and moons. And he's so inspired, and he talks to her, she's making the quilt, and after a couple of weeks he realizes that maybe 1868 Alexander, Maine is a little too quiet, and he'll go back to 1968, so he does, and he starts making work that is very much like Anne Drain Cotter's, and he becomes an international celebrity for his art. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But this also is definitely an art quilt, even though it's a bed quilt. It's definitely an art quilt. So that's everything, and thank you for your patience.